What if I told you that one of history's most feared institutions started because of a lie about converted Jews eating Christian babies? What if I told you that the Spanish Inquisition killed far fewer people than a single day of World War II, yet its name still sends chills down our spines? And what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about the Spanish Inquisition is completely wrong? Welcome back to the channel, where we dig deep into history's most misunderstood events. Today, we're talking about the Spanish Inquisition, and I guarantee that by the end of this video, your entire perspective on this dark chapter of history will be turned upside down. We're going to explore the shocking truth behind why it really started, the brutal methods they actually used, and the surprising ways it shaped the modern world. But first, let me ask you something. When you hear Spanish Inquisition, what comes to mind? Torture chambers? Burning heretics? Religious fanatics hunting down innocent people? Well, buckle up. Because the real story is far more complex, far more political, and far more relevant to today's world than you ever imagined. Let's start with the biggest shock of all. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't really about religion. I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. Picture this. It's 1478, and Spain has just become a unified kingdom under Ferdinand and Isabella. For centuries, Spain had been a patchwork of different kingdoms, religions, and cultures. Jews, Muslims, and Christians had lived side by side for hundreds of years. But now, the new monarchs faced a massive problem. How do you unite a country full of people who speak different languages, follow different religions, and have completely different loyalties? The answer? Create a common enemy. Enter the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure or threat of expulsion. These conversos had become incredibly successful in Spanish society. They were bankers, merchants, doctors, and even held positions in the church and government. And that success bred resentment among the old Christians, people whose families had been Christian for generations. Sound familiar? This is the same pattern we see throughout history when minority groups achieve economic success. Now, here's where it gets really dark. Ferdinand and Isabella didn't just want religious unity. They wanted economic control. The conversos controlled massive amounts of wealth and trade networks. By accusing them of secretly practicing Judaism, the crown could seize their property, eliminate their debts to Jewish lenders, and redistribute their wealth to loyal supporters. It was basically legalized theft on a national scale. But they needed a way to make this seem legitimate and holy. So they went to Pope Sixtus IV and requested permission to establish their own Inquisition. Now, this is crucial to understand. Inquisitions already existed in other parts of Europe, but those were controlled by the Pope. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted something different, an Inquisition controlled by the Spanish crown, not Rome. The Pope initially refused, sensing this was more about politics than faith. But the Spanish monarchs were persistent, and eventually, they got their way. On November 1st, 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued the papal bull, Exigit Sinceris, Devotionis Affectus. This document gave birth to what would become the most infamous Inquisition in history. But here's what's really wild. The first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, was himself descended from conversos. Yes, you heard that right. The man who would become the face of persecution against converted Jews was likely of Jewish ancestry himself. This tells us everything we need to know about the true nature of the Spanish Inquisition. It wasn't about pure religious conviction. It was about power, control, and political survival. Now let's talk about what actually happened during these investigations. Contrary to popular belief, the Inquisition had very specific legal procedures. They couldn't just grab anyone off the street. Someone had to be formally accused of heresy, specifically of being a baptized Christian who was secretly practicing another faith. When the Inquisitors arrived in a town, they would first issue an Edict of Grace. This gave people 30 to 40 days to come forward and confess their sins voluntarily. Those who confessed during this period usually received light punishments, maybe some prayers, fasting, or a small fine. But those who didn't confess and were later accused faced a much harsher process. The accused would be arrested and held in secret. They wouldn't be told who accused them or exactly what they were charged with. Instead, they would be asked to examine their conscience and confess their sins. This psychological pressure was often more effective than physical torture. Imagine being locked in a cell, not knowing why you're there, and being told that your salvation depends on confessing sins you might not even be aware you committed. Many people broke down and confessed to things they had never done, just to end the uncertainty. But when confession wasn't forthcoming, the Inquisition did resort to torture. However, and this might surprise you, torture was actually less common in the Spanish Inquisition than in regular Spanish courts of the time. Modern historians estimate that torture was used in only about 2% of cases. When it was used, there were strict rules. A doctor had to be present to make sure the accused didn't die. Torture sessions were limited in time and intensity, and confessions made under torture were only valid if the person confirmed them later without being tortured. The most common torture methods were the garrucha, where the victim was suspended by their wrists with weights attached to their feet. The toca, which was essentially waterboarding. They would force water down the victim's throat while they were strapped to an angled board. And the potro, a rack that stretched the victim's limbs. These methods were designed to cause intense pain without permanent injury or death. The goal wasn't to kill, it was to break the person's will and extract a confession. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the auto de fe, or act of faith. These were the public ceremonies where punishments were announced and carried out. Popular culture has turned these into spectacles of mass burning, but the reality was quite different. Most auto de fe ceremonies involved dozens or hundreds of people receiving various punishments. Some wore special garments called sanbenitos to show their shame. Others were sentenced to prison terms, fines, or exile. Only the most serious cases, those who refused to repent or who relapsed into heresy, were relaxed to the secular arm. This meant they were turned over to civil authorities to be burned at the stake. But here's the shocking truth about the death toll. For over 350 years, from 1478 to 1834, modern historians estimate that the Spanish Inquisition executed between 3,000 and 5,000 people. That's roughly 10 to 15 people per year across the entire Spanish Empire. To put that in perspective, more people die in traffic accidents in Spain every single month today. This doesn't make the Spanish Inquisition acceptable or minimize the suffering it caused, but it does challenge the popular image of constant mass executions. The real power of the Inquisition wasn't in the people it killed, it was in the fear it created. The knowledge that you could be accused in secret, by anyone, for almost anything, created a climate of paranoia and conformity. People monitored their own behavior and that of their neighbors constantly. They were afraid to speak certain words, eat certain foods, or engage in certain practices that might be interpreted as signs of secret Judaism or Islam. This social control was far more effective than any torture chamber. The Spanish Inquisition also had massive economic and cultural impacts. Entire communities of skilled craftsmen, merchants, and intellectuals fled Spain to escape persecution. This brain drain weakened Spain's economy and contributed to its eventual decline as a European power. The obsession with purity of blood, proving that your ancestors had always been Christian, created a rigid caste system that stifled social mobility and innovation. By the time the Inquisition was finally abolished in 1834, Spain had fallen far behind other European nations in science, technology, and economic development. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Spanish Inquisition was on how we think about religious freedom and human rights. The stories of Inquisition victims helped inspire Enlightenment thinkers to argue for separation of church and state. The American founders specifically designed the First Amendment to prevent the kind of religious persecution that the Inquisition represented. Even today, when we talk about protecting minority rights and preventing government overreach, we're partly responding to the lessons learned from the Spanish Inquisition. So why do we still find the Spanish Inquisition so fascinating and terrifying? Part of it is because it represents our deepest fears about authority and persecution. The idea that you could be accused in secret, tried in private, and punished for your thoughts and beliefs touches something primal in human psychology. but it's also because the Spanish Inquisition was one of the first examples of a modern police state. It had a sophisticated bureaucracy, detailed record-keeping, and a network of informants throughout society. These are the same tools that totalitarian regimes have used throughout history to control their populations. In many ways, the Spanish Inquisition was a preview of the horrors of the 20th century. The final irony? The Spanish Inquisition ultimately failed in its primary goal. Despite centuries of persecution, crypto-Jewish and crypto-Muslim communities survived in Spain. They preserved their traditions in secret, passing them down through families for generations. Some of these communities still exist today, finally free to practice their ancestral faiths openly. The human spirit, it turns out, is far more resilient than any Inquisition. So there you have it, the shocking truth about the Spanish Inquisition. It wasn't the religious massacre that popular culture portrays. Instead, it was a calculated political tool used by ambitious monarchs to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and control their population. The real horror wasn't in the torture chambers. It was in the climate of fear and suspicion that poisoned Spanish society for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, the Spanish Inquisition teaches us lessons that are still relevant today. About how fear can be weaponized to control populations. About how minority groups become scapegoats during times of economic and political stress. And about how the pursuit of purity and conformity ultimately weakens rather than strengthens a society. If this video changed how you think about the Spanish Inquisition, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. What other historical events do you think have been misunderstood or misrepresented? And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started exploring history's most shocking secrets. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, keep questioning everything you think you know about history, because as we've seen today, the truth is usually far more complex and fascinating than the stories we tell ourselves. I'll see you in the next video.